Yeah, good morning, everyone. In the last session, we discussed about what is JWT authentication and how to implement that JWT authentication by using Spring Boot. JWT stands for JSON Web Tokens. It is used to secure our REST APIs by using token. So here, JWT token will be available in the token contains three parts. The first part is called payload header. Second part is called as payload. Third part is called as signature. Now here I have given the GitHub repository of yesterday's application. So in that application, we have implemented user registration functionality by using data JPA, and we implemented user login functionality by using Spring Security. When user logged in successfully, then JWT token will be generated based on the username. That token will come as a response to the user. Once user is having the token, then he can access remaining methods available in the application. Okay. In order to validate the token, we have created one filter. That filter will execute for every request. Okay. And for which URLs security is required, for which URLs the token is required, for which URLs the token is not required, we have customized our security filter chain. Registration login URLs we are permitting. Any other URL we are authenticating by using that JWT. So here, when the client is sending a request, first he will register, then he will log in. When he log in, he will get the token as a response. Once he get the token, to access the next URL of our application, they need to send that JWT token in the request header. So when they are sending in the request header, it should be in the form of key and value. Key will be authorization and value will be bearer token. Bearer space token will be available. So here in the REST API, we implemented that token concept. Now we need to implement that token concept in the microservices architecture. As we discussed yesterday, in the microservices architecture, multiple APIs will be available for our application. It's not one API. We will be having multiple APIs in our application. In the yesterday session, we created one single REST API. In that REST API, we have implemented JWT token. But are we going to do that token implementation for every microservice, guys? Is it recommended to implement token for every microservice in our application? No. Token should not be implemented for every microservice in the application. So what we do is, here our service registry will be available, and here our backend APIs will be available. Inside the backend, multiple APIs will be available. Assume that I'm taking API 1, API 2, like this multiple APIs will be available, 1, 2, and 3. So if I implement JWT token in every API, then what is the problem? It will become duplicate code. We should not write the duplicate code in our application. So like this, I'm taking 3 APIs in my project. For these three APIs, I want to secure by using JWT token. So the best approach in order to work with these things is the token implementation. We are going to do by using one more microservice, which is called authentication service. Authentication API will be available. What logic will be available in the authentication API? Authentication API will contain the logic for token generation. In the yesterday session, we have taken two classes mainly. One is a JWT service, another one is filter. What is the responsibility of the JWT service? Generate the token. What is the responsibility of the filter? validate the token. One class is responsible to generate the token. Another class is responsible to validate the token. Now, here, token generation will be available in the authentication API. Token validation will be available in the API gateway. So customers will not access backend APIs directly. We will not give the URLs of backend APIs directly. So to access our backend APIs, we will be using one API gateway. What is the responsibility of API gateway in the microservices? What is the responsibility of backend APIs in the microservices? What is the responsibility of API gateway in the microservices? Microservices will be accessed through API gateway. API gateway will act as a front controller. So it is responsible to manage all the backend APIs of our application. Now, this authentication API is going to communicate with the database also. For all the APIs, database will be available in which we are going to store our data. Authentication API also will communicate with the database for registering the user to verify the login credentials of the user. Once the user is logged in successfully, then he will get the token as a response. Once he is having the token, by using that token, he can access our backend APIs through API gateway. So what logic will be there in this API gateway? Inside the API gateway, filter will be available and routing will be available. What is the purpose of routing? To specify which request should go to which microservice, that routing will be there in the API gateway. And in the API gateway, we are going to write one filter also. Inside that filter, I'm going to check. In that filter, I'm going to check token is available or not, the token is valid or not. If a token is valid, then only they can access my microservices. Otherwise, they cannot access my microservices. For authentication API, any security is required? No. Anybody can register and anybody can log in, right? But once they log in successfully, then only token will come. If a token is available, then only API gateway will allow the people to access our microservices. So in the real time, the microservices security will be implemented like this. Okay, I have given that project Git repository also, where I have implemented security for the microservices. Let me clone my GitHub repository. So already we know how to create service registry, how to create config server, how to create backend APIs, how to create API gateway, how to create JWT, how to create filter. By using all these concepts, we created one simple microservices project where security is available. Now, let me take one Git repository. So this is security folder. Let me clone my Git repository, git bash here, git clone microservices security. Clone this Git repository. So in this repository, there are multiple projects available. One is service registry, which is Eureka server. What is the role of service registry in our application? It is used to register all the microservices of our project. The next one, config server is available. What is the purpose of config server? To externalize configuration properties of our application. Welcome API available, greet API is available. These are actual REST APIs which we want to secure by using JWT. And there is a authentication service is available. What logic will be there in the authentication service? What is the logic in the authentication service? Authentication service contains the logic to generate the token when the user login successfully. Then API gateway is available. What is the role of API gateway in the project? It is managing all the backend APIs of our application. Okay, so let's go to import. Let me switch to workspace. Let me choose this security, microservices security. I'm choosing this one as my workspace. Yeah, so we got all the projects into our IDE. I have selected the folder where all these projects are available. So open project. No, I think it's not working. Choosing security workspace. Yeah. So currently I don't have any project in this workspace. File, import, Maven project. Existing Maven project is available. Browse. So under security here, service registry project is there. Click on finish. So with this, I imported my service registry application. No need to explain anything because already we know how to create service registry. So here, there is a class. In that class, we are writing one annotation called enable Eureka server. Now go to resources, YML file is available. Port number we are configuring as 8761. Same application should not register with the Eureka. So let me run this application, right click, run as boot application. So Eureka server is going to start with the port number 8761. We can see it's a dashboard. What are the services registered with the Eureka server? Clear the console, go to browser, let us access that. Localhost colon 8761. Eureka dashboard is coming. Currently, no instances are available with the Eureka. Second one, I'm going to import config server. Okay. Now here, config server is available. This config server is going to load the configuration properties from my GitHub repository. Okay. Go to config server. You can see in the start class, we enabled one annotation called enable config. We already worked on this project. Config server annotation is available. Go to YML file. I'm configuring the port number as 1111 and I'm giving my GitHub repository URL. So where my YML files are available. Okay, let us start this config server, run as boot application. Config server is running on the port number 1111. Okay, clear the console. Good. Next one, let me import our actual microservice, which is welcome API and greet API. So go back, security. Here, welcome API is available, import. So in this welcome API, it is going to act as a client for Eureka server. Do I need to register this application with Eureka manually or it is not required? Not required. I no need to register this application with Eureka manually because Eureka server is already running on the port number 8761. This application should act as a client for the config server. So I have given config server information. And if you go to our application, just we are having one REST controller annotation. We are having one REST controller annotation. From where it is getting the message? Is it a hard-coded message or it will get from the config server? It will get from the config server. Just message the text I am getting and I am returning that text by using /welcome URL pattern. That's it. Same concept for greet API also. Import greet application now. Greet API is available. Greet API also will act as a client for Eureka and will act as a client for config server also. Greet API running on the port number 3333. It is acting as a client for config server and application name is greet. So earlier in the welcome API, the application name is welcome. Good. So guys, I'm using this code because already we developed all these things previously. Next, import our another application which is called authentication service. Let us go for another application which is called authentication service. Here is the logic available to generate token. User registration, user login will happen in the authentication service. As it is going to communicate with the database, we need to configure our database credentials here. Okay. Database username and password we need to configure. So let me check my database credentials. Username is root, password is ashokit@123. Root and ashokit@123. That's it. Fine. We are ready. Go to this application. You can see here REST controller is available. Authentication REST controller is available. / register method is there. Service called save user. How we are saving the user? We are encoding the password and we are saving the user. Then authentication controller token method is available. We can also call it as a login also. I'm calling it as a login. How this login is going to happen? By using authentication manager. If a login is successful, then I am sending token as a response. Request is authentication request. Username and password will come in the request. And what is the response we are giving? Token I am giving. Is it a login valid login or not? I'm giving as a response. So it is going to communicate with the database. For that, as we discussed, the service will be available. Authentication service is available. Authentication service is available. And in this authentication service, we are having save user, generate token, validate token methods are available. For that, we created JWT service class. As we have seen yesterday, generate token method will be available and validate token method will be available. Good. And there is a filter also available. This is not required here. Then entity is available. Configuration is available. Authentication configuration / authentication register / authentication login / authentication validate. I want to allow all the URLs which are available in our application. Provider we are configuring, manager we are configuring, password encoder will be available, and security filter chain also we are configuring. Basically, what are the URLs available? We are allowing all those URLs. One is request binding class. Another one is response binding class. Good. So now we are having one more application called API gateway. What logic will be available in the API gateway? What is the logic in the API gateway? Filter logic will be available in the API gateway. So what is that filter? What is the filter? Validate. The token is valid or not. That will be available in our filter. 1 minute. It is 06 API gateway. 06 API gateway. So this is the 6th application. I'm just renaming that project. Perfect. So with this, all our projects are ready. Now, let's run these projects one by one. Project clean. I'm cleaning all the projects which are available. So the first one I'm going to start, that is service registry. Go to console. Service registry is started. Eureka server. Then start our config server. Run as boot application. Config server will be started. Then welcome API. Welcome API, which is going to act as a client for Eureka as well as client for the config server. Run as our welcome API. Welcome API will register with Eureka server. we can check in the Eureka dashboard. Yes, welcome API is running with the port number 2222. Then greet API is available. This also will act as a client for Eureka and client for config server. We can check that. Greet API is registered with 3333. Welcome API registered with 2222. Then I'm going to run authentication service. In that application, logic is available for user registration, logic available for token generation. Run as boot application. Authentication service is started. Unable to dialect. It is failed, guys. 1 second. Unknown database. Okay. Database name is wrong here. Our database name is SBMS36. Okay. Let me update this project. Refresh. Maven update. Yeah. Run this. Run as boot application. Authentication service also will register with the Eureka server. On what port number authentication service is running? It is running on the port number 4444. When I started this application, you can see that table also will be created. Okay. So create table, user credential table is available. Go to our MySQL database. Go to MySQL database. There will be user credential table here. Connect with the database. Use the database. The database name is SBMS36. Selected. Then select star from user credential. Yeah. So when I select this table, do we have any data in the table now? No. Table is empty. Email, name, and password. My table is empty. So good. Next, let us go and start our API gateway. So if you see API gateway here, start class is available, which is acting as a client for Eureka. And here config is available. One REST template we created, but we don't need that. Authentication filter is available. What is authentication filter, guys? What is the purpose of this filter? Validate the token. If the token is valid, it will process. If a token is invalid, it will throw the exception. So this filter is going to execute and it will verify our token is valid or not. Good. So inside this YML file, configuration will be available. What is this configuration, guys? What is this configuration available here? Routing configuration will be available. Now you see there are 3 types of routings I have configured. What are the 3 types of routings we configured? First, if the path is /welcome, then it should forward the request to welcome API. Request will go to welcome API directly, or request will be validated with the filter. Here in the API gateway, we are telling that filter should be applicable for which API. Okay. So this filter should be applicable for my welcome API. Filter should be applicable for greet API. If I remove this filter from here, what will happen? Security will be there for the API. Security will not be there. Security will not be there. Directly it will forward the request to welcome API. I don't want that. Whenever the request comes to API gateway, I want to apply authentication filter. What is the logic available in the filter? It will check token is available or not. If a token is available, then only it will process the request. Otherwise, it is not going to process the request. For greet API also, filter is added. So in our application, one filter is available for which service that filter should be executed. We are configuring in the YML file. When the request is /welcome, the request should be forwarded to welcome API. Before forwarding the request to welcome API, you execute this filter. When the request comes to greet URL, it should go to greet API. Before going to greet API, that filter should be executed. Inside that filter, logic is available to verify token is valid or not. Are you getting my point? Fine. So let's start this API gateway also. Maven, update this project. Right click, run as boot application. Okay. Go to Eureka, and can you see here all the applications which are registered with the Eureka server? First one is welcome API running on the port number 2222. Second one is greet API running on the port number 3333. Third one is authentication service running on the port number 4444. Fifth one is API gateway, which is running on the port number 5555. Config server, I did not register with the Eureka server. Our APIs will get the information from the config server. The text message, good morning message, greet message, welcome message available in the config server. Our REST APIs will connect with the config server to get the details. So in order to access this application, what is the first step we need to do, guys? Now I want to access my welcome API. Can I go and access my welcome API directly? How do we access our APIs now? Directly or through API gateway? Through API gateway. What is the port number of the API gateway? 5555. Now go to Postman and try to access our API gateway welcome API. Localhost colon, what is the port number of API gateway? 5555/welcome. So I'm trying to hit the URL of our welcome API. Clear all the history. Okay. Now, so I'm going to send a GET request localhost colon 5555/welcome. So you see the diagram. You see our service registry here. Which service is running on the port number 5555? API gateway. Go to routings in the API gateway. I'm sending the request to API gateway server with the /welcome as a URL. So what is the responsibility of the API gateway now? What is the responsibility of the API gateway now? It should forward the request to welcome API directly or with filter. With filter. Why filter? To validate it is a valid request or not. What that filter is expecting? Token it is expecting. Do I have the token now? I don't have the token. So send a request, get request localhost colon 5555/welcome. Click on send. When I send the request, what it is saying, guys? Error. Error is coming. What it is saying? Missing authorization header. Boss, you are not sending the header in the request, so I cannot process your request. Let's try with the greet also. /greet I am using. /greet I am using. When I send the request to greet URL, what is the configuration available for the greet URL? If it is greet, it should go to greet API directly or with filter. With filter. So in the API gateway, filter is available. So that filter will execute for every microservice, or we can configure for which microservice filter should be executed. We can configure for which microservice that filter should be executed. Okay. Then now I want to send the request for authentication API. I want to send the request for authentication API. You can directly access authentication API or through API gateway also. you can access that API. What is the URL? What is the port number of the authentication API? 4444. Now go to authentication API REST controller and see what data it is expecting for user registration. Go to REST controller. Inside this REST controller, user registration method is available. What is the parameter? Credentials object. What data it is expecting? Name, email, and password. Expecting the name, email, and password. So send post request, which is 4444/API/register. I have given class level URL pattern as auth, not API, /auth/register. I'm going to send the name, email, and password in the JSON format. Go to body, then send the data in the JSON format. First one is name. So let me give the name, then email, then password. Name, email, and password. So these are the keys I'm sending in the JSON request. Before sending this request, let us verify our table. Any record available in the table? No, record is not available. Go to Postman and send the request. Click on send. What is the response we are getting? User added to the system. I'm directly accessing my API gateway without any security. I'm able to insert the record into table. Go to database and verify. Now can you see the record is inserted? Password is storing directly or encrypted password. We are using encrypted password to store the data into table. Then I want to log in. I want to log in. In order to log in here, there is another method. Login method is available. What it is expecting? Authentication request. What it is expecting in the authentication request? Username and password. Okay. So the key will be changed now. It is not just name. We are giving it as a username. Email ID is not available. I'm sending only my username and password. Suppose if I give some wrong password, see what will happen. I'm giving incorrect password for the login method. Giving incorrect password for the login method. When I give this incorrect password for the login method, what it is saying? Token is coming or token is not coming? Token is not coming. What it is saying? Valid login? No. It is invalid login. That's why we are not getting any token. So let me give my valid password. Let me give valid password. Click on send. Then what is the response? Token is coming. Login valid is yes. It is a valid login and I'm getting token also in the response. If I have this token, now can I access my other microservices? Can I access other microservices? Yes. Take this token, go to welcome URL. Directly if I click, it is saying missing authorization header. Now go to here, auth bearer token and give the token that we got in the response. Now send the request. When I send the request, now I am able to access my REST API. Welcome to Ashok IT. From where this message is coming? From the config server. My REST API is connected to config server. It is loading the data from the GitHub repository YML. Let us go for greet method also. Localhost : 5555/greet. So token is available. Click on send. Am I able to get the good morning? Yes, these two REST APIs I'm able to access by using token. If I don't send the token, then what is happening? Missing authorization header. So this is how microservices will be secured in the real time. So if we don't write the logic for security in every microservice, a project can contain 30 microservices, 50 microservices also. In every microservice, we are not going to write the logic for the security like token generation, token validation. We don't implement in all the APIs which are available in the application. For registration, for login, authentication API will be available. For token validation, API gateway will be available. Any request which is coming to our application should come through API gateway. It will manage all the backend APIs. Which request should go to which microservice, for which request token should be validated, for which request filter should be executed. All the common logics of the microservices will be available in the API gateway. Are you guys clear? So with this we understood the real-time approach to secure our microservices. If it is a monolithic application, only one application will be available. Security will be available at only one place. If it is a microservices, multiple APIs will be available. So in every API, we don't write the security. Security will be available at one place and all the microservices will use the same technique. So that common logic will be there in the API gateway. You got the clarity? So GitHub repository I have already given for these projects. So there is nothing new here. We know what is service registry. We know what is API gateway, what is greet API, welcome API, authentication API. 2 times we implemented user registration and login in the class. So first time Spring Security with registration login we implemented last week. Yesterday also we implemented registration and login. The new thing for us is creating the token by using JWT service class and a filter. Filter is used to validate the token. In the yesterday application, JWT token creation, filter verification in one project. But today, token generation is available in one microservice. Filter validation is available in the API gateway. That's it. Good. So with this, we are good with Spring Security, guys. Very, very, very important. We spent enough time to understand what is Spring Security and how to implement that Spring Security for our applications. So by using this Spring Security, we can perform both authentication and authorization. Spring Security main purpose is to perform authentication and authorization for our Spring and Spring Boot applications. Okay, it is highly customizable framework, guys. So in order to work with this security, we are using security starter. When you add this starter, default basic authentication will come. If you don't want that, you can override the credentials also like this. You can secure specific URL patterns of the application also by customizing filter chain object. Then we have seen in-memory authentication, configuring more than one user. Like this, you can configure more than one user. And we have seen JDBC authentication. Nowadays, people are not using this JDBC authentication. The reason is we need to write the queries on our own. We need to write the queries on our own to perform the user authentication. Currently, people are using what kind of security? User detail service. You write the user detail service and you can secure your application. This is user registration and user login with the Spring Security. Then after we have seen what is OAuth security with the GitHub integration. So if you have account in the GitHub, then you can access our REST API. Then we discussed about JWT. JWT stands for JSON Web Tokens. Header, payload, signature will be available. We implemented this JWT in single REST API and we implemented JWT with the microservices architecture also. Now here, microservices with the JWT security. Auth service contains functionality for user registration and user login. Okay, if user logged in successfully, if user login successfully, then auth service will generate JWT token and will send it as a response. Auth service contains functionality for user registration and user login. If user login successfully, then auth service will generate JWT token and will send it as response to user. Okay. Now API gateway contains logic to validate the token using filter. Okay. Now in API gateway, we have added routings for our microservices along with a filter. So when we access any microservice, then API gateway, when we access any microservice through API gateway, then API gateway will execute filter to validate the token. If a token is valid, then only API gateway will route the request. Otherwise it will throw exception. So this is the logic is available in our microservices security. Authentication service contains functionality for user registration and user login with MySQL DB. I have added MySQL database configuration there. So in the authentication service, we have the functionality for registration and login with MySQL database. If user login successfully, then authentication service will generate JWT token and will send it as response to user. API gateway contains logic to validate the token using filter. In API gateway, we have added routings for our microservices along with filter. For which microservice filter should be executed, we have configured that in our API gateway. When we access any microservice URL through API gateway, then gateway will execute the filter to validate the token. If token is valid, then only API gateway will route the request to particular microservice. If a token is invalid, then API gateway will throw the exception. So this complete project setup is available in my GitHub repository, microservices security. In this microservices security, welcome API, greet API, authentication service, API gateway, config server is also available. So this greet API, welcome API, getting the messages from the config server. Those are whatever the response we are getting, that response is not a hard-coded response. Whatever the response you are getting, that response is not the hard-coded response. This response is coming from the config server. Good. So with this, we are done with the most important concept in the Spring, that is Spring security. In every interview, they are going to ask questions on the Spring security. Can you tell me what is a Spring security and how you are using Spring security in your project? What is Spring security and how you are using Spring security in your project? And can you tell me how to implement Spring security with respect to microservices architecture? Are you writing the security for every microservice in your application? What is the best approach to secure our microservices? We know answer now. So the token generation in one service, token validation will be there in the API gateway. Good. So fine guys. So with this, coming to microservices, we discussed about what is monolithic architecture. We discussed about what is monolithic architecture, and we discussed about drawbacks with monolith. What is the drawback with monolith? Single point of failure. Everything is available only at one place. If any small change is needed, then the entire application should be redeployed. Burden will be increased on the server also. That's why we are going for microservices. What is microservices? Is it a framework? Is it a technology? No. What is this? It is a architectural design pattern. Any programming language developer can use this microservices architecture to develop their applications. Okay. Microservices is a design pattern to develop our application with the loosely coupling. Instead of developing everything in one big application, we are going to develop small services. Okay. Then we discussed about microservices advantages. What are the advantages with the microservices? What are the advantages with the microservices? Loosely coupled, technology independence, burden will be reduced on the server. If any change required, we can deploy only that particular microservice. If one microservice is down, still another microservices are going to execute. And there are some challenges with the microservices also. There are some challenges with the microservices. What are the challenges with microservices? Configurations will be duplicate and the development is expensive. The development will be expensive because lot of infrastructure is required to develop these microservices, and visibility will not be available for the programmers. You will not get the complete picture. And simple example, suppose in the project, if you did not work on authentication service, you are working on only these kind of APIs, then you don't know where is the security for your application. This is happening with 70 to 80% of the developers in the market. They are working in the project from 3 years. They are working on the REST APIs, but they don't know what is the security for their application. Why they don't know? Other team implemented that authentication service. Some other team implemented that API gateway. Every day, you are getting the requirement to develop one REST API. In your REST API, request will come, you will give the response. That's it. There is no security. So that visibility problem will be available when you go for microservices architecture. Good. Then after, we have seen microservices architecture, guys. Microservices architecture. Is there any fixed architecture for the microservices? No. So people are using according to their requirement. In some projects, API gateway may not be available. In some projects, service registry may not be available. In some projects, PN client may not be available. Admin server, Jipkin server, Redis, Kafka, these all are optional. If it is required, then only people will use that. Then we discussed about what is service registry. What is service registry? We are using Eureka server as a service registry. We are using Eureka server as a service registry. And we discussed about admin server. What is the purpose of admin server? What is the purpose of admin server? It is used to monitor and manage all the APIs at one place. So for every API, actuators will be available. Accessing every API actuators separately is difficult. I want one common platform where I can access all the actuators at one place. That's where we are going for admin server. Then we have seen Jipkin server. Jipkin server. It is a jar file. We can run that jar file. So it will provide distributed tracing that is required for our application. Then we have seen backend APIs. What is the meaning of backend APIs? Actual REST APIs. So you can create a book API, product API, any API that you want for your application. Those are called as backend APIs. When we go for backend APIs, we are going to use PN client. When we go for backend APIs, we are going to use PN client. What is that PN client? Which is used for inter-service communication. When one microservice want to communicate with the another microservice, then we are going to use this PN client concept. Then we discussed about load balancing in the microservices. If I run my REST API, if so many requests are coming to my REST API, burden will be increased on the server. How to reduce that burden? How do we reduce that burden? By using multiple instances. Instead of running our microservice in one instance, I will run in the multiple instances. Then PN client will distribute the load by using ribbon concept. Okay. Then we discussed about API gateway. We discussed about API gateway. What is API gateway in the project? Which is entry point for all the microservices available in our application. Any common logic required for the project, we are going to implement in the API gateway. Okay. Then we discussed about config server. We discussed about config server. What is the purpose of config server? Which is used to externalize configuration properties of our application. It is not at all recommended to configure, the details within the project YML. Always we need to separate the YML from the project. For that, we are going to use config server. In the real time also, config server will be available. Config server will load the properties from GitHub repository. Then we discussed about Redis cache. Before that, we discussed about circuit breaker. We discussed about circuit breaker, which is also called as resilience forge. Circuit breaker we implemented by using resilience forge. What is the purpose of circuit breaker? What is the purpose of circuit breaker? Circuit breaker is used for developing fault tolerant system. It is used to develop fault tolerant system. What is the meaning of fault tolerant system? What is the meaning of fault tolerant system? When some problem occurred, instead of giving error response to the client, I want to execute some fallback logic. I'm trying to get the data from the Redis. Suppose if Redis server is down, then I will go for database to get the data. So when there is a problem, we want to execute some fallback logic. For that, we are going for circuit breaker. Then we discussed about Redis cache. What is Redis cache? What is Redis? Distributed cache. So if you want to reduce number of DB calls in the application, then we can go for the cache implementation. Redis server we have configured in the cloud platform. Multiple REST APIs can connect with the Redis server. The Redis server is a data store which will store the data in the form of key and value. So we discussed about this Redis cache as well. So in the microservices, we learned these topics. Anything else we covered? Monolith, microservices, architecture, service registry, admin server, Zipkin, backend APIs, PN client, load balancing, API gateway, config server, circuit breaker, Redis cache we learned. Kafka we did not discuss as of now. Then we discussed about Spring security. We discussed about Spring security. In the Spring security, we have seen authentication and authorization. Authentication means who can access our application. Authorization means what they can access in our application. And here we have seen HTTP basic authentication. HTTP basic authentication. Then next one, we discussed about in-memory authentication. We discussed about in-memory authentication. And we discussed about JDBC authentication. And we have implemented user details service. User details service. to configure users. I don't want to write the queries with the data JPA directly. I want to load the user details in the Spring Security. And we done project by using register plus login using Spring Security. We implemented one project with registration and login using Spring Security. And we discussed about OAuth. If you want to use one application by using other application account, then you can go for OAuth. Using Google account, you can access Ashok IT website. Using Google account, you can access HackerRank website. Using GitHub account, you can access a HackerRank website. By using social media accounts, if you want to allow the users to access your application, then we are going to use that OAuth security. And we discussed about JWT security in the Spring Boot, JWT security in the REST API, and we discussed about microservices security with the JWT. Microservices security with the JWT. These are the topics we learned related to Spring Security. These are the topics we learned related to microservices architecture. Got my point? So this is what we learned in the last 1 month of time. Almost 1 month, right? Yeah, more than that, I think so. So are you confident on the microservices now? So 100% sure in the industry, the people are struggling to work with the Spring Security concept. It is a little confusing part for the beginners. And whatever that we discussed, this knowledge is equal to 3+ years of experienced developer. And you talk to any 3 years experienced Java developer with respect to these microservices topics. So literally they will get shocked. Array, this is experienced developer content. In the industry, the people who are having 3 to 4 years experience, they will implement these kind of logics in the application. For the fresher, this much chance will not be available. Okay, so do the practice properly so that in the interview, you can definitely, they will ask questions from these topics. Without questions on microservices and security, your interview will not be completed. Your interview will not be completed. 100% they will ask questions on the security. Okay, so we are going to conduct mock interviews, right? In those also, I told them to ask questions on the core Java, Spring Boot, and microservices and project also. Okay, so prepare for that. Next one. The next topics that are pending, we need to discuss about Spring Batch. We need to discuss about Spring Batch. We need to discuss about Kafka, Docker, JUnit, and Jenkins. So with this, our Spring Boot syllabus will be completed. Docker, we have class this is Saturday at 5:30 p.m. Offline and online class is available for the Docker. Saturday and Sunday, we are going to work on the Docker part. So this weekend, I'm going to discuss on Docker. 17th and 18th, we are going to learn the Docker. 24th and 25th, we are going to learn the Jenkins. Okay, these are 2 tools. These are important for other people also, for JRTP people, for Spring Boot people. I'm planning these 2 tools on the weekends, right? So this weekend, we are going to work on the Docker. Next weekend, we are going to work on the Jenkins as well. Okay, similarly, Kafka is available, JUnit available, batch concept is available. Tomorrow we will try to work on Spring Batch concept. Already I have given a video on the batch as well. So if you go to our YouTube videos, Spring Batch video I have provided. I just want you to go through that video before coming to tomorrow's session. Yeah, 3 months back, I explained what is Spring Batch framework, why we need to go for Spring Batch framework. So please go through this. Spring Boot batch processing. Process millions of records at a time by using Spring Batch. I will share this video link. Please go through this one so that you will understand how we have implemented batch. The code also is available in the GitHub repository. Source code link is also available in the GitHub. I want you people to go through this video before coming to next session. So, or else today you focus on this security practice with the JWT microservices security. We'll continue in the tomorrow session. Okay, good. Perfect. Let me upload these notes. Okay, good guys. Now, association mapping, Saga design pattern will cover along with Kafka. Saga design pattern will cover with Kafka. Association mapping also we are going to learn. Good. Any questions, anyone? Online students? Anybody having any questions?
Sir, if we have more REST APIs,
Yep.
each YML file will have their own each config server.
No, sir. If you have multiple microservices also, one config server will be available for the project. For every microservice, we don't create separate config server. For the entire project, one config server will be available.
In that only all the YML files will be available.
In that GitHub repository, all the suppose you have 20 microservices. 20 microservices YMLs will be available in the single GitHub repository. One config server will load all the YMLs from the GitHub repository. For every microservice, separate config server will not be available.
If it is a different module, then we'll create a different config server, right, sir?
No, sir. Generally for the project, one config server, sir.
Sir,
Even if it is a different module also, no.
Example, for my understanding, I'm asking. For example, trains API and bus API we have in Redbus app. So for these two modules, we will have only one config
So
server?
if you go to Make My Trip application, in the Make My Trip application, flights available, cabs available. These all are belongs to one application. One config server will be available. For clients, for flights, one config server. For buses, one config server, no. And again, it depends on the project architecture. If they want, they can do like that also. But generally, one config server sufficient for whole application.
Okay, thanks.
So Mike, as I told you, there is no standard architecture for microservices. People can customize according to their requirement. Maybe they can use 2 config servers or they will use only 1 config server. It depends on the project requirement. In our project, we have 1 config server.
Okay.
Sir, if there is any sensitive information that is to be placed in the YAML file, will we put it directly in the GitHub YAML file or will we encrypt
sensitive information in general in the real time, we are going to load the sensitive information from a different servers called VCAP server concept will be available, sir. Username and passwords directly we don't mention in the YML. So they will be loading from a different server, which is called VCAP servers in the real time.
So that will be connected to config server.
Correct.
Sir, and one more thing, in microservices architecture, if we want to implement role-based access for certain controllers, how do we do that
in the security configuration? You need to specify user will be loaded with the data, right? So in the filter, in the security chain, we are going to specify if that user is having this role, then only he can access, otherwise he cannot access.
Okay.
All good. Fine, guys. With this, I'm stopping for today. We'll meet again in the tomorrow session.